The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace, as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red uniform jacket for what he believed would be the last time. After 23 years of faithful service to the crown, the veteran guard had witnessed 3 coronations, countless state visits, and more royal ceremonies than he could count. His weathered hands, which had once trembled with nervous energy during his first day on duty, now moved with practiced precision as he prepared for his final shift. Thomas had always been different from the other guards. While his colleagues maintained their stoic silence and followed orders without question, he possessed an unusual curiosity about royal protocol and constitutional law. During his off-duty hours, he spent countless evenings in the palace library, reading ancient texts about monarchy traditions and legal precedents. His fellow guards often teased him about his scholarly pursuits, calling him Professor Mitchell behind his back. The palace corridors buzzed with unusual activity that morning. Servants hurried past carrying silver trays, their faces bearing expressions of concern and confusion. Palace officials huddled in small groups, whispering urgently among themselves. Something significant was happening, though the guards had not been briefed about any special events scheduled for the day. As Thomas took his position outside the throne room, he noticed Lord Chancellor William Pemberton approaching with a group of senior courtiers. The Lord Chancellor's face appeared pale and strained, quite different from his usual composed demeanor. Behind him walked several members of the Privy Council, their formal robes rustling against the polished floors as they moved with purposeful steps toward the royal chambers. The massive oak doors of the throne room opened, and Queen Elizabeth emerged, her crown slightly askew and her usual regal composure noticeably shaken. Thomas had served long enough to recognize when something was amiss in the royal household. The Queen's lady-in-waiting followed closely behind, carrying what appeared to be official documents sealed with red wax. Thomas overheard fragments of conversation as the royal party passed. Words like constitutional crisis, invalid proclamation, and emergency session drifted through the air. His scholarly mind immediately began piecing together the implications of such language. In all his years of service, he had never witnessed such apparent chaos within the palace walls. The Queen paused directly in front of Thomas, her piercing blue eyes meeting his for a brief moment. In that instant, he saw something he had never seen before in her expression: uncertainty. The monarch who had ruled with unwavering confidence for decades seemed genuinely troubled by whatever crisis had befallen the royal court. "Guard Mitchell," she said softly, using his name for the first time in over 2 decades of service. "You have served this crown faithfully. Tell me, in your understanding of royal protocol, what constitutes a valid royal decree?" Thomas felt his heart racing. Never before had the Queen directly addressed him with such a serious question. The other guards around him shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether they should acknowledge hearing the conversation or maintain their traditional silence. "Your Majesty," Thomas replied carefully, "a valid royal decree must be properly witnessed, sealed with the Great Seal, and proclaimed according to constitutional precedent." His voice remained steady, despite the extraordinary nature of the situation. The Queen nodded slowly, her expression growing more troubled. And if such a decree were to be challenged on constitutional grounds, what would be the proper procedure? Thomas felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. His years of studying royal law had prepared him for this moment, though he never imagined such knowledge would be tested in direct conversation with the sovereign herself. "Your Majesty, any challenge to a royal decree must be formally presented to the Privy Council and reviewed according to established legal precedent. However, if the challenge concerns the fundamental legitimacy of the decree itself, it must be addressed immediately to prevent constitutional crisis." The Queen's expression darkened. "I see you understand the gravity of our situation, Guard Mitchell. What I'm about to tell you must remain in the strictest confidence until the matter is resolved." Thomas nodded solemnly, aware that he was about to become privy to information far beyond his station as a simple palace guard. "This morning, we received word that a formal challenge has been raised against my recent proclamation, granting a new royal title. The challenger claims that the proclamation violates ancient constitutional law and is therefore invalid. This challenge comes not from Parliament or the courts, but from within our own household staff." The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. A challenge from within the royal household represented the most serious type of constitutional crisis possible. Such actions could potentially destabilize the entire monarchy, if not handled with extreme care and wisdom. Furthermore, the Queen continued, the challenger has demanded a formal hearing before the full court, with all proceedings made public. They claim to possess evidence that the title I granted violates laws dating back to the reign of King George III. Thomas's mind raced through the constitutional implications. A public challenge to royal authority had not occurred in over 2 centuries. The last similar incident had resulted in significant restrictions on royal power and had forever changed the relationship between the Crown and Parliament. Your Majesty, Thomas said carefully, if I may ask, what is the nature of this new title that has prompted such a challenge? The Queen's face softened slightly, revealing a hint of maternal pride mixed with her obvious concern. I granted my grandson the title of Duke of Cambridge with extended privileges, including hereditary rights that supersede traditional succession laws. The challenger claims this action exceeds my constitutional authority. Thomas immediately understood the severity of the situation. Altering succession laws or granting unprecedented hereditary privileges could indeed violate fundamental constitutional principles. The challenger might have legitimate grounds for their objection. The hearing has been scheduled for tomorrow morning, the Queen continued. The challenger will present their case before the full royal court, with members of Parliament and the judiciary in attendance. The outcome could potentially invalidate not only this recent proclamation, but could also call into question my authority to grant any future titles or honors. As the Queen spoke these words, Thomas realized that his final day of service would become one of the most significant days in recent royal history. He was witnessing the beginning of a constitutional crisis that could reshape the British monarchy forever. The palace bells began to chime, marking the hour and reminding everyone present that time was running short, to prepare for what promised to be an unprecedented legal and constitutional battle. The very foundations of royal authority were about to be tested in the most public and dramatic way possible. The identity of the challenger sent shockwaves through the palace when it was finally revealed. Margaret Thornfield, the Queen's personal secretary for over 15 years, had filed the formal constitutional objection. Her reputation as a loyal and discreet servant made her challenge all the more surprising and significant. Thomas learned of this development through hushed conversations among palace staff as he continued his rounds throughout the day. Margaret had begun her career as a junior clerk in the royal household, working her way up through dedication and an exceptional understanding of royal protocol. She possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of constitutional law and had often been consulted by senior courtiers when complex legal questions arose. Her colleagues respected her intellect and trusted her judgment completely. The previous evening, Margaret had discovered disturbing inconsistencies while reviewing the documentation for the Duke of Cambridge title grant. Her trained eye immediately recognized that several required procedures had been bypassed in the rush to formalize the new title. More troubling still, she found evidence that the extended privileges granted with the title directly contradicted laws established during the constitutional reforms of 1782. As Thomas gathered more information throughout the day, he learned that Margaret had spent the entire night researching precedents and gathering evidence to support her challenge. She had consulted ancient legal texts stored in the palace archives, some dating back over 3 centuries. Her findings suggested that the Queen's proclamation not only violated established law but could potentially invalidate other recent royal decisions, if allowed to stand. The palace atmosphere grew increasingly tense as word of the challenge spread among the staff. Long-serving employees who had never questioned royal authority found themselves uncertain about their loyalty. Should they support their beloved Queen, or should they respect Margaret's commitment to constitutional law? The division created an uncomfortable tension that permeated every corner of the royal residence. Thomas encountered Margaret in the palace library during his afternoon rounds. She sat surrounded by towering stacks of legal documents, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled from exhaustion. Her eyes were red from hours of intensive reading, but her expression showed unwavering determination. "Guard Mitchell," she said, looking up from a particularly thick volume of constitutional law, "I understand you have considerable knowledge of royal protocol. I want you to know that my challenge comes from loyalty to the crown, not opposition to it." Thomas approached carefully, aware that their conversation could have significant implications for both of them. "Miss Thornfield, your reputation for loyalty is beyond question. However, many are wondering why you chose to pursue this challenge rather than addressing your concerns privately with Her Majesty." Margaret's expression grew solemn. "I attempted to discuss my concerns with Lord Chancellor Pemberton yesterday morning. He dismissed my objections without proper consideration, claiming that royal prerogative supersedes all constitutional limitations. Such a position is fundamentally dangerous to the monarchy itself." She gestured toward the documents spread across the table before her. "These texts clearly demonstrate that the powers of the crown are not unlimited. The very laws that protect the monarchy also place constraints upon it. If we ignore these constraints, we risk undermining the legal foundation that supports royal authority." Thomas understood her reasoning, though he also recognized the personal cost of her decision. By challenging the Queen publicly, Margaret was essentially ending her career in royal service. Even if her legal arguments proved correct, her relationship with the royal family would never recover from such a dramatic confrontation. Furthermore, Margaret continued, the precedent set by this particular title grant could have far-reaching consequences. If the Crown can arbitrarily alter succession laws and grant unprecedented privileges, what prevents future monarchs from making even more dramatic changes to constitutional arrangements? Her words carried the weight of genuine concern for the long-term stability of the British constitutional system. Thomas realized that Margaret's challenge represented more than a simple legal dispute. It was a defense of the principles that had guided the monarchy for centuries. As evening approached, preparations for the following day's hearing intensified throughout the palace. The throne room was being reconfigured to accommodate the unprecedented gathering of legal and political figures who would witness the proceedings. Members of Parliament, senior judges, and constitutional scholars were traveling from across the country to attend what many considered the most significant royal legal challenge in modern history. The Queen's legal team worked frantically to prepare their defense of the title grant. Led by the Lord Chancellor, they searched through centuries of precedent to find examples of similar royal actions that had been accepted without challenge. Their task was complicated by the fact that Margaret's research appeared to be exceptionally thorough and well documented. Thomas observed the Queen herself as she met with her advisors in the evening. Her usual confidence appeared shaken, and she frequently consulted handwritten notes while discussing strategy with her legal counsel. The weight of defending not only her recent decision, but potentially her entire constitutional authority, was clearly taking its toll. Prince William, the intended recipient of the challenge title, arrived at the palace that evening. His face showed the strain of having his honor become the center of a constitutional crisis. Thomas watched as he met privately with his grandmother, their conversation lasting well into the night. The media had begun gathering outside the palace gates, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Constitutional law experts were already debating the potential implications on television, though few possessed enough information to offer informed commentary. The official palace statement had been deliberately vague, referring only to routine legal proceedings regarding royal protocol. Margaret spent her final evening of preparation in solitude, reviewing her arguments one last time. She had declined offers of assistance from constitutional lawyers, preferring to present her case based purely on her own research and understanding. Her decision reflected both her confidence in her legal position and her desire to maintain the integrity of her challenge. Thomas completed his final security rounds of the palace, knowing that tomorrow would bring changes that none of them could fully anticipate. The institution he had served faithfully for over 2 decades was about to face its most severe legal test in generations. The outcome would determine not only the validity of a single royal title, but potentially reshape the relationship between royal authority and constitutional law. As midnight approached, the palace settled into an uneasy quiet. Tomorrow's hearing would begin at 10 o'clock sharp, and both sides had prepared as thoroughly as possible for what promised to be a historic confrontation between loyalty and law, tradition, and constitutional principle. The throne room had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom, though it retained its magnificent royal splendor. Red velvet chairs were arranged in precise rows facing the throne, where the Queen would preside over the unprecedented hearing. Golden chandeliers cast warm light across the assembled crowd of Britain's most distinguished legal and political minds. Thomas stood at attention near the main entrance, his position allowing him to observe the historic proceedings while maintaining his security duties. The gravity of the moment was not lost on him. He was witnessing an event that would be studied by constitutional scholars for generations to come. Lord Chief Justice Sir Robert Hawthorne entered first, his black robes rustling as he took his designated seat in the front row. Behind him followed members of the Privy Council, their faces bearing expressions of concern and curiosity. Parliamentary leaders from both major political parties had accepted invitations to attend, recognizing that the outcome could affect the balance of power between the Crown and elected government. Margaret Thornfield appeared precisely at 10 o'clock, carrying a leather briefcase that contained months of meticulous research. She wore a simple black dress with pearl earrings, projecting an image of respectful dignity despite the revolutionary nature of her challenge. Her composure impressed Thomas, who understood the enormous pressure she faced in this moment. The Queen entered last, wearing the diamond diadem and a midnight blue dress. Her bearing remained regal despite the unusual circumstances, though Thomas noticed a slight tension in her posture that betrayed her inner anxiety. She took her position on the throne with practiced grace, but her eyes reflected the weight of defending her constitutional authority. Lord Chancellor Pemberton rose to address the Assembly, his voice carrying formal authority despite his obvious discomfort with the proceedings. Your Majesty, distinguished guests, we gather today to address a constitutional challenge raised by Miss Margaret Thornfield regarding the recent proclamation granting His Royal Highness Prince William the title of Duke of Cambridge with extended privileges. The formal opening seemed to crystallize the surreal nature of the situation. A commoner was challenging the monarch's decisions in the most public forum possible, with the highest legal authorities in the land serving as witnesses to the confrontation. Margaret was invited to present her case first. She approached the center of the room with measured steps, her research materials organized in neat folders. When she began to speak, her voice carried clearly through the vast chamber, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. Your Majesty, distinguished members of this assembly, I appear before you today not as an opponent of the Crown, but as a defender of the constitutional principles that have protected the monarchy for centuries. Her opening statement immediately established the framework for her argument. She was protecting the institution, not attacking it. She continued, the proclamation issued on the 15th of this month grants Prince William a title with privileges that exceed those permitted under the Constitutional Reform Act of 1782. Specifically, the hereditary rights included in this grant contradict established limitations on royal prerogative power. Margaret opened her first folder and withdrew a centuries-old document. This is the original text of King George III's agreement to constitutional limitations following the American colonial crisis. His Majesty explicitly accepted that future title grants would be subject to parliamentary oversight when they included extraordinary privileges. The Lord Chief Justice leaned forward with interest, recognizing the significance of the historical precedent Margaret was citing. Parliamentary leaders exchanged glances, suddenly understanding the broader implications of her challenge for the balance of governmental power. Furthermore, Margaret continued, producing additional documents. The specific privileges granted to Prince William include hereditary judicial authority that was explicitly abolished by the Courts Act of 1848. No subsequent legislation has restored such authority to the Crown. Thomas watched the Queen's expression carefully as Margaret presented each piece of evidence. Her Majesty's face remained composed, but he could see her hands gripping the arms of the throne with increasing tension. The challenge was proving more substantive than palace advisors had anticipated. Margaret's presentation lasted 45 minutes, during which she methodically dismantled the legal foundation for the title grant. Her arguments were clear, well-documented, and devastating in their implications. She concluded by stating, the Crown's authority derives from its adherence to constitutional law. When royal proclamations violate established legal principles, they undermine the very foundation of monarchical legitimacy. The Queen was then invited to respond to the challenge. She rose from the throne, a gesture that surprised many observers who expected her to remain seated throughout the proceedings. Her decision to stand demonstrated the seriousness with which she viewed Margaret's arguments. "Miss Thornfield," the Queen began, her voice carrying both authority and a note of personal hurt, "your research is thorough and your concerns are noted. However, you fundamentally misunderstand the nature of royal prerogative power." The Queen's legal team had prepared her well for this moment. She argued that the constitutional limitations cited by Margaret applied only to extraordinary circumstances and that title grants fell within the traditional scope of royal authority. Her position was that parliamentary oversight was advisory rather than mandatory for such decisions. "The precedents you cite," the Queen continued, "emerged from specific historical crises and were never intended to completely restrict royal authority over honors and titles. The monarchy has granted similar privileges throughout history without constitutional challenge. The exchange between the sovereign and her former secretary was extraordinary in its directness and intellectual rigor." Thomas realized he was witnessing a constitutional debate at the highest possible level, with both participants demonstrating impressive legal knowledge and rhetorical skill. However, Margaret's response revealed a crucial weakness in the Queen's position. She produced correspondence from 1923 showing that King George V had sought parliamentary approval for a similar title grant, establishing a precedent that contradicted the current Queen's claims about royal prerogative independence. The revelation caused a visible stir among the parliamentary observers, who recognized that the precedent Margaret had discovered significantly strengthened her legal position. The Lord Chief Justice made notes throughout the exchange, clearly impressed by the quality of Margaret's research and argumentation. As the formal presentations concluded, the assembly recessed for deliberation. The Queen retired to her private chambers while legal experts consulted among themselves about the constitutional implications of the arguments they had witnessed. The outcome remained uncertain, but Margaret's challenge had proven far more substantial than anyone had anticipated. During the recess, the palace corridors buzzed with intense conversations as legal experts and political figures processed what they had witnessed. Thomas observed small groups of parliamentarians discussing the implications of Margaret's revelations, their voices carrying tones of surprise and concern. The constitutional challenge was proving far more serious than anyone had initially believed possible. The Lord Chief Justice requested access to the palace archives to verify some of Margaret's historical citations. A team of legal clerks accompanied him to examine the original documents that formed the basis of her arguments. Their preliminary findings confirmed the authenticity and relevance of her evidence, adding credibility to her constitutional challenge. Prince William arrived during the recess, his face showing the strain of having his honor become the center of such controversy. Thomas watched as palace advisors briefed him on the morning's proceedings. The prince's expression grew increasingly troubled as he learned about the strength of Margaret's legal arguments and the potential consequences for his new title. In her private chambers, the Queen consulted with her most trusted legal advisors. Lord Chancellor Pemberton appeared visibly shaken as he admitted that Margaret's research had uncovered precedents that the royal legal team had overlooked. The 1923 correspondence she had produced was particularly damaging because it established a clear pattern of parliamentary consultation for similar title grants. Meanwhile, Margaret spent the recess alone in the palace library, reviewing her remaining arguments and preparing for what she anticipated would be intense questioning from the Queen's legal representatives. Her years of service had given her unprecedented access to historical documents, and she had used that access to build a virtually unassailable case. The revelation that most disturbed palace officials was Margaret's discovery of a secret agreement from 1953, the year of the Queen's coronation. The document showed that the young Queen had privately committed to seek parliamentary oversight for any title grants that included extraordinary privileges. This agreement had been forgotten by successive palace administrations, but Margaret's meticulous research had brought it back to light. Thomas encountered several foreign ambassadors who had been quietly invited to observe the proceedings. Their presence indicated that international interest in the constitutional crisis was significant. The outcome would influence how other constitutional monarchies approached similar questions about the limits of royal authority. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere in the throne room had noticeably shifted. The Lord Chief Justice's verification of Margaret's evidence had convinced many observers that her challenge possessed genuine constitutional merit. Parliamentary leaders who had arrived expecting a routine proceeding now recognized they were witnessing a potential turning point in British constitutional history. The Queen's legal team attempted to salvage their position by arguing that the various precedents Margaret had cited were exceptions rather than binding rules. They claimed that royal prerogative had always included the power to grant titles with special privileges, and that occasional consultation with Parliament did not constitute a legal requirement. However, Margaret's rebuttal demolished their argument with surgical precision. She presented additional evidence showing that every title grant with extraordinary privileges since 1923 had included some form of parliamentary consultation. The pattern was so consistent that it clearly established a constitutional convention, if not a binding legal requirement. Your Majesty, Margaret said, addressing the Queen directly, the evidence demonstrates that your own father and grandfather recognized the necessity of parliamentary involvement in such decisions. Your current position contradicts not only historical precedent, but also the private commitments made at your own coronation. The reference to the Queen's coronation commitments struck with particular force. Several senior courtiers had been present at that ceremony and remembered discussions about constitutional limitations on royal power. Margaret's research had revealed that these discussions had resulted in specific commitments that had been subsequently ignored or forgotten. The Queen's response revealed both her legal sophistication and her growing frustration with the challenge to her authority. Miss Thornfield, you mistake political courtesy for constitutional requirement. My consultations with Parliament have been matters of respect and tradition, not legal obligation. But Margaret was prepared for this argument as well. She produced a legal analysis prepared by the law officers of the Crown in 1954, just 1 year after the Queen's coronation. The analysis clearly stated that title, grants with judicial or administrative privileges required parliamentary approval to ensure constitutional compliance. The document was particularly devastating because it represented the official legal position of the Queen's own government. The analysis had been requested specifically to clarify the extent of royal prerogative power in the post-war constitutional environment. Its conclusions directly supported Margaret's position and contradicted the current royal legal team's arguments. Parliamentary leaders began exchanging significant glances as they realized the full implications of Margaret's evidence. If her interpretation was correct, not only was the recent title grant invalid, but several other royal decisions over the past decades might also be constitutionally questionable. The emotional climax of the hearing came when Margaret addressed the personal cost of her challenge. Your Majesty, I have served this crown faithfully for 15 years. My challenge today ends my career in royal service, but I cannot remain silent when constitutional principles are being violated. The monarchy's strength comes from its adherence to law, not its ability to circumvent legal limitations. Her words carried genuine emotion and conviction that impressed even her opponents. Thomas could see that several observers were moved by her obvious sincerity and personal sacrifice. She was destroying her own livelihood to defend constitutional principles that she believed were essential to the monarchy's survival. The Queen's final response revealed the depth of her personal hurt at Margaret's public challenge. Miss Thornfield, your loyalty to constitutional law is noted, but your method of addressing these concerns has caused unnecessary damage to the Crown's reputation. These matters could have been resolved through private consultation rather than public confrontation. Margaret's reply was immediate and pointed. Your Majesty, I attempted private consultation through the Lord Chancellor. When my concerns were dismissed without proper consideration, public challenge became the only remaining option to protect constitutional integrity. The exchange highlighted the fundamental disagreement between personal loyalty and institutional responsibility that lay at the heart of the constitutional crisis. As the formal arguments concluded, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented in modern British history, a direct constitutional challenge that could reshape the relationship between the Crown and Parliament forever. The deliberation process following the formal presentations proved to be as dramatic as the hearing itself. The Lord Chief Justice convened an emergency session with senior legal experts to evaluate the constitutional implications of Margaret's evidence. Their discussions continued for over 3 hours, with heated debates about precedent, royal prerogative, and the proper limits of monarchical authority. Thomas remained at his post throughout the deliberations, observing the various reactions of political and legal figures as they processed what they had witnessed. Several senior parliamentarians expressed private concerns about the broader implications of the case. If Margaret's interpretation was correct, it could require parliamentary review of numerous past royal decisions. The Prime Minister arrived unexpectedly during the deliberations, having been briefed about the seriousness of the constitutional challenge while attending an international summit. His presence indicated that the government was now treating the matter as a potential crisis, requiring immediate political attention. Thomas watched as he was escorted directly to meet with the Queen in her private chambers. The Queen's emotional state became increasingly evident as the day wore on. Palace staff reported that she had been seen pacing in her private chambers, something observers had never witnessed before in her decades of reign. The personal betrayal she felt from Margaret's public challenge was combining with genuine concern about the constitutional implications of the case. Margaret spent the deliberation period in the palace chapel, seeking solace in prayer after the intensity of her confrontation with the sovereign. Several observers noted the symbolic significance of her choice. She was literally seeking sanctuary within the institution she had challenged. Her presence in the chapel demonstrated that her actions stemmed from conscience rather than personal ambition. Prince William's reaction to the proceedings became a significant factor in the developing crisis. Sources close to the royal family reported that he had privately expressed willingness to renounce the challenge title if it would resolve the constitutional conflict. His position reflected both personal humility and recognition that the controversy was damaging the monarchy's reputation. The legal experts' preliminary conclusions began leaking through unofficial channels during the afternoon. Initial reports suggested that Margaret's constitutional arguments were substantially correct, though questions remained about the appropriate remedy for the situation. The possibility of requiring parliamentary ratification for the title grant was being seriously discussed. The political implications of the case began extending beyond constitutional law into practical governance questions. Opposition party leaders started suggesting that the controversy demonstrated the need for broader reforms to clarify the limits of royal authority. Government ministers found themselves defending not only the Queen's specific decision, but the entire constitutional framework surrounding royal prerogative. International media coverage intensified throughout the day as news of the constitutional challenge spread beyond Britain's borders. Constitutional monarchies around the world watched carefully, recognizing that the precedent established in London could influence similar debates in their own countries. The case was being treated as a potentially watershed moment for modern constitutional monarchy. The emotional toll on all participants became increasingly apparent as the deliberations continued. Margaret's colleagues reported that she appeared exhausted but resolute, maintaining her conviction that constitutional principles must take precedence over personal relationships. Her sacrifice was becoming a symbol of institutional integrity for supporters of her position. The Queen's advisors struggled to develop a response strategy that would preserve royal dignity while addressing the substantial legal concerns Margaret had raised. The discovery of the forgotten 1953 agreement had fundamentally undermined their initial defensive position, forcing them to consider more substantial concessions than they had anticipated. Parliamentary leaders found themselves in the unusual position of potentially having to rule on the validity of royal actions. The precedent such involvement would establish concerned many who preferred to maintain traditional separation between royal prerogative and parliamentary authority. However, Margaret's evidence suggested that such separation had never been as complete as commonly believed. As evening approached, reports emerged that a compromise solution was being discussed among the key participants. The proposal involved the Queen acknowledging the constitutional concerns while maintaining the validity of Prince William's title through a process of retroactive parliamentary consultation. This approach would resolve the immediate crisis while establishing clearer procedures for future cases. The compromise negotiations revealed the personal relationships underlying the constitutional drama. Despite her public challenge to royal authority, Margaret had maintained the respect of many palace officials who recognized the integrity of her position. Several senior courtiers privately acknowledged that her concerns about constitutional compliance were legitimate and important. The Queen's ultimate decision would require balancing multiple competing considerations. Personal pride and institutional dignity argued for maintaining her original position, while constitutional propriety and political wisdom suggested the need for substantial accommodation. The unprecedented nature of the situation meant that no clear precedent existed to guide her choice. Thomas observed the steady stream of advisors, officials and experts flowing through the palace corridors as the crisis approached its resolution. The institutional machinery of British government was adapting in real time to address a constitutional challenge that none of the participants had ever expected to face. The creativity and flexibility of the response demonstrated the resilience of the constitutional system. As night fell over Buckingham Palace, the historic day was drawing toward a conclusion that would establish new precedents for the relationship between royal authority and constitutional law. The outcome would determine not only the fate of Prince William's title but also the future procedures for royal decision-making in the modern constitutional monarchy. The emotional intensity of the day had transformed what began as a technical legal dispute into a profound examination of the principles underlying British constitutional government. Both the Queen and Margaret had demonstrated remarkable courage in defending their respective positions, creating a drama that would be remembered as a defining moment in the evolution of the British monarchy. The final session convened at 8 o'clock that evening, with the throne room illuminated by hundreds of candles that cast dancing shadows across the assembled crowd. The formal atmosphere had given way to something more solemn and historic, as everyone present understood they were about to witness a moment that would reshape British constitutional tradition forever. The Queen entered wearing her full state regalia, including the imperial state crown and the purple robe of state. Her decision to appear in such formal attire signaled the gravity with which she viewed the resolution of the constitutional crisis. Thomas noticed that her bearing had regained its usual regal composure, though her eyes still reflected the emotional strain of the day's proceedings. Lord Chief Justice Hawthorne rose to announce the conclusions reached by the panel of legal experts. His voice carried unusual weight as he addressed the assembly with findings that would establish new constitutional precedent. After careful review of all evidence presented, we find that Miss Thornfield's constitutional arguments possess substantial merit and legal foundation. The announcement sent a visible ripple through the assembled crowd. Parliamentary leaders exchanged significant glances while royal courtiers struggled to maintain their composure. The validation of Margaret's challenge by the highest legal authorities in the land represented a fundamental vindication of her position. However, the Lord Chief Justice continued, "We also recognize that the resolution of this matter must balance constitutional propriety with practical governance needs and respect for the dignity of the crown." His word suggested that a compromise solution had been developed that would address the legal concerns while minimizing damage to royal authority. The Queen then rose to address the assembly, her voice carrying both authority and humility in a combination that demonstrated her political skill and personal grace. "We have heard the constitutional concerns raised by Miss Thornfield, and we acknowledge the validity of her research and arguments." Her acknowledgement of Margaret's position represented an unprecedented moment in modern royal history. Never before had a reigning monarch publicly accepted the legitimacy of such a direct challenge to royal authority. The gesture demonstrated both personal courage and constitutional wisdom that impressed even her critics. "Therefore," the Queen continued, "we hereby establish new procedures for future royal title grants that include extraordinary privileges. Such grants will henceforth require formal consultation with Parliament before implementation." Her announcement established a new constitutional convention that would govern royal decision-making for generations to come. The Queen's next words addressed the immediate crisis while preserving Prince William's honor. "Regarding the current title grant to our grandson, we shall submit this matter to Parliament for retroactive review and approval. Should Parliament approve the grant, the title will stand as proclaimed. Should Parliament decline approval, the title will be modified to comply with constitutional requirements." This solution preserved the possibility of maintaining Prince William's title while acknowledging the constitutional concerns Margaret had raised. It represented a masterful political compromise that addressed the legal, issues without requiring the Queen to admit error or causing humiliation to any party. Margaret was then invited to respond to the Queen's announcement. She approached the throne with visible emotion, her eyes reflecting both relief and sorrow at the outcome of her challenge. "Your Majesty, your gracious response demonstrates the wisdom and constitutional dedication that has made your reign so distinguished." Her words of reconciliation were carefully chosen to heal the personal breach that her challenge had created while maintaining the integrity of her constitutional position. "I am gratified that the concerns I raised have been addressed in a manner that strengthens, rather than weakens, our constitutional traditions." The Queen's response revealed her own emotional journey throughout the crisis. "Miss Thornfield, your dedication to constitutional principle, while personally painful to us, has ultimately served the Crown well. Your challenge has reminded us that royal authority derives its legitimacy from adherence to constitutional law." The exchange between the sovereign and her former secretary represented a remarkable moment of reconciliation that transcended their legal disagreement. Both women had demonstrated exceptional courage and integrity throughout the crisis, earning mutual respect despite their fundamental disagreement. Prince William then stepped forward to address the assembly, his presence adding personal dignity to the constitutional resolution. "I accept whatever decision Parliament reaches regarding my title. The integrity of our constitutional system is more important than any personal honor." His statement demonstrated both maturity and understanding of the broader principles at stake. The parliamentary leaders present agreed to expedite the review process, with a formal vote scheduled within 2 weeks. The compressed timeline would minimize uncertainty, while ensuring proper deliberation of the constitutional issues involved. Initial indications suggested that Parliament would likely approve the title, with minor modifications to address the legal concerns. The international observers expressed admiration for the mature and dignified manner in which the constitutional crisis had been resolved. The British system had demonstrated its capacity for adaptation and evolution, while maintaining respect for both royal dignity and constitutional principle. The precedent established would influence constitutional debates in monarchies worldwide. As the formal session concluded, Margaret approached the Queen for a private moment of reconciliation. Their brief conversation, conducted in whispers that only Thomas could partially overhear, seemed to focus on personal forgiveness rather than constitutional matters. The Queen's final words to Margaret were, "Your loyalty to the Crown, though expressed in unexpected ways, has never been in doubt." The resolution of the crisis required Margaret's departure from royal service, as her relationship with the royal family could never fully recover from such a public confrontation. However, her sacrifice had achieved its intended purpose of protecting constitutional principles while strengthening, rather than weakening, the monarchy itself. The evening concluded with an informal reception where political and legal figures discussed the implications of the day's events. The consensus was that British constitutional democracy had been strengthened by its ability to resolve such a fundamental challenge through peaceful dialogue and mutual respect rather than political crisis. Thomas reflected on his role as witness to this historic day as he completed his final security rounds of the palace. The institution he had served faithfully for over 2 decades had demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability in facing its most serious constitutional challenge in generations. 2 weeks later, Parliament voted overwhelmingly to approve Prince William's title with minor modifications that addressed the constitutional concerns Margaret had raised. The vote of 412 to 23 in the House of Commons, with similar margins in the House of Lords, demonstrated broad political support for the compromise solution that had emerged from the constitutional crisis. The parliamentary debate preceding the vote had been remarkably civil and constructive, focusing on constitutional principles rather than partisan politics. Members from all parties praised both the Queen's gracious response to the challenge and Margaret's courageous defense of constitutional law. The proceedings established new standards for discussing royal prerogative within the democratic process. Thomas attended the parliamentary session as part of the security detail, allowing him to witness the conclusion of the dramatic events he had observed from their beginning. The sight of parliamentarians formally ratifying a royal decision represented a historic shift in the relationship between Crown and Parliament, establishing a new model for constitutional cooperation. Margaret had been offered several prestigious positions in constitutional law following her departure from royal service. Universities competed to recruit her as a lecturer in constitutional history, while legal chambers sought her expertise in royal prerogative law. Her principled stand had transformed her from a palace secretary into a respected constitutional authority virtually overnight. The Queen's handling of the crisis had earned widespread praise from constitutional experts and political commentators. Her willingness to acknowledge legitimate constitutional concerns while maintaining royal dignity was cited as an example of mature constitutional leadership. Public opinion polls showed increased respect for the monarchy following the resolution of the challenge. Prince William's title was formally confirmed with the modified privileges that Parliament had approved. The changes were minor but symbolically important, demonstrating that even royal honors were subject to constitutional oversight. His gracious acceptance of the parliamentary process had enhanced his personal reputation and strengthened public support for the younger generation of royals. The new procedures established by the Queen were formalized in a constitutional document that would guide future royal decision-making. All title grants, including extraordinary privileges, would now require parliamentary consultation before proclamation. The process would be streamlined to avoid delays while ensuring constitutional compliance. International reaction to the British resolution of the constitutional crisis was overwhelmingly positive. Constitutional monarchies in Europe, Asia, and the Commonwealth studied the precedent established in London, with several countries initiating similar reforms to clarify the relationship between royal prerogative and democratic oversight. The palace atmosphere had gradually returned to normal, though the events had left lasting changes in how royal decisions were made. A new position of constitutional advisor was created to review royal proclamations before issuance, ensuring that similar crises would be prevented through advanced consultation rather than reactive challenge. Thomas completed his transition to retirement with a sense of pride in having witnessed and helped facilitate one of the most important constitutional developments in modern British history. His scholarly interest had prepared him to understand the significance of the events, making his final days of service personally meaningful. Beyond his security duties, Margaret's departure from the palace had been marked by unexpected gestures of respect from colleagues who initially opposed her challenge. Many palace staff came to understand that her actions had ultimately protected the institution they all served by ensuring its adherence to constitutional principles. Her courage had earned admiration even from those who disagreed with her methods. The Queen privately expressed gratitude to several advisors for their handling of the crisis, particularly praising those who had counseled compromise and accommodation rather than confrontation. The resolution had demonstrated the value of seeking constitutional solutions rather than purely political ones, establishing a model for addressing future challenges to royal authority. The long-term implications of the constitutional crisis extended far beyond the immediate question of Prince William's title. The precedent established would influence how royal prerogative was exercised for generations to come, creating a more collaborative relationship between Crown and Parliament while preserving the essential dignity and authority of the monarchy. Legal scholars began incorporating the events into constitutional law curricula at universities throughout the Commonwealth. The case study provided an excellent example of how constitutional systems could evolve peacefully to address changing circumstances while maintaining fundamental principles and institutional respect. The personal relationships damaged by the constitutional challenge began slowly healing as time provided perspective on the events. The Queen's Christmas message that year included subtle references to the importance of constitutional adherence and the value of principled disagreement within democratic institutions, signaling her continued respect for Margaret's position. Thomas often reflected on the extraordinary day that had concluded his royal service career. The events had demonstrated that constitutional principles could triumph over personal relationships and institutional inertia when individuals possessed sufficient courage to defend them. Margaret's sacrifice had strengthened the very institution she appeared to challenge, the transformation of a routine palace secretary into a constitutional hero captured public imagination and inspired renewed interest in constitutional law among young people. Margaret's example demonstrated that ordinary citizens could influence the highest levels of government when they possessed knowledge, courage, and unwavering commitment to principle. Years later, historians would mark the constitutional challenge as a turning point in the evolution of the British monarchy. The peaceful resolution of the crisis had demonstrated the system's capacity for adaptation and renewal, ensuring its continued relevance in an increasingly democratic world. The precedent established that day created a new model for constitutional monarchy that balanced traditional royal authority with democratic accountability. The compromise solution satisfied competing demands for both royal dignity and constitutional propriety, establishing principles that would guide the institution through future challenges and changes. Thomas concluded his observations of this historic period with deep appreciation for having witnessed constitutional democracy at its finest, where principle triumphed over convenience and wisdom prevailed over pride, ensuring that the British system of government emerged stronger and more legitimate than ever before.